Welcome to Cigar City Radio, episode number 43. I'm your host, Randy Ojeda, and making the magic happen, the man with the plan, Mr. Jason Solanas.
You know what I've been into lately, Randy?
I'm a little nervous to find out.
Just really.
Oh, that sounds horrible.
Don't rock it. Well, yeah, you can rock it. You can rock
All right,
it before you
yeah.
knock it.
I mean, yeah, I guess you could rock it.
Then you have reason to knock it for sure.
Yeah, because you would have rocked it.
I would have been rocked.
For more episodes, head to cigarcityradio.com or subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever your favorite podcast app is. Just search for Cigar City Radio. You can also connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, and on all those networks, our username is Cigar City Radio.
This episode of Cigar City Radio was recorded at the Blind Tiger in Ybor City. The Blind Tiger is a 1920s speakeasy style coffee shop serving coffee, tea, vegan pastries, and more, with locations in Ybor City and Seminole Heights. You can check them out at blindtigercafe.com.
In this episode, I got to sit down with the former owner and proprietor of King Corona Cigars, Don Barco, to discuss music over the course of his life. I've had the privilege to have many discussions about it with him in the past and knew I had to get him on the mic. We talked about his first memory of music at 3 years old, getting to experience the Beatles in their earliest years, music as it relates to politics, getting to know Led Zeppelin on mind-altering substances, and much, much more. We wish Don and his lovely wife, Brenda, a happy and fulfilling retirement.
So here it is, episode number 43.
What's your first memory of actually listening to music?
I was probably about 3 years old. I was living my first years where I grew up in Ruskin. And I must have been 3 years old, and my mother was ironing. We were in her bedroom. I was laying on the bed. She was ironing. It was summer in Florida. I remember it being hot, just like it is now. And there was a guy singing on the radio, and I remember my mother saying something about that being her favorite singer, and it was Hank Williams. So then, I was exposed to Hank Williams, one of the greats in American music when I was 3 years old.
Did you like it back then?
Yeah, because there was nothing else. I mean, there was at that time, my mother. Although my mother did listen to a lot of different types of music, she was a big Elvis fan when Elvis came along about 2 or 3 years later. The only music we listened to, we had the radio, and back then the radio was what I remember was either country music or pop music, and the pop music at the time, that was pre-rock and roll. There was the guys like Perry Como. Middle of the road stuff, Frank Sinatra, that type of thing. So it was kind of, I probably listened to more country music, and I remember the other exposure was probably a year later when we got our first TV, was watching the Grand Ole Opry.
Yeah.
And so I was, again, exposed to, the people that were popular at that time in country music, which was guys like Ernest Tubb and little Jimmy Dickens and Marvin Rainwater and people like that. And, I didn't know that there was an other until Elvis came along. And that was like science fiction. I mean, that was a totally different world. And I remember as a kid watching him and looking around at the adults in the room. They were doing just, above the waist shots of him because they didn't want to get the gyrations. They were afraid that they were going to screw their kids up, with sex and stuff, But I remember being, he had this snarl and he had this pompadour with the curl hanging down like a Superman curl. And I remember him kind of scaring me.
Really?
Which, it was because he had that snarl, and I was a little kid, he scared me, but I liked it.
Yeah.
You know, it was
dangerous.
Yeah, it was dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was kind of, and trying to figure it out. You know, I was lucky enough to be around in music, to be alive when supposedly rock and roll started.
Yeah.
You know,
during the birth.
when it was born.
Yeah.
And getting to see all those people on TV back then, Elvis Presley and Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, all those people back then, and just thinking it's always going to be like this. You know, it was like every day somebody new came along. And, you know, there were some posers, you know, like Pat Boone, doing covers of Little Richard's music, which should have been, Pat Boone should have gone into satire comedy, really. It was that bad.
Yeah. So how do you think he got popular then?
Well, as happened back then, what white America did back then, black music back then, you know, before rock and roll, that type of music, that music was already there. White people weren't aware of it by and large because they weren't listening to it. They weren't exposed to it. But like would happen and has happened often is that the innovators, it seems a lot of it came from the black community, from the black world. And so white community would rip it off. I mean, they would rip it right off and put it on to white America, and it was still good because the essence of the music was good. But it had been homogenized and watered down so much that, I mean, all you have to do is look at a side-by-side video of Pat Boone and Little Richard.
Yeah.
And it's like looking at a pitcher in high school and a pitcher in the major leagues. There was that much difference. It was apparent even to a 6 or 7 year old kid like me. I mean, if you had
that's all too similar.
Yeah.
Do you think that's the beginning of formulaic rock and roll? Is that era? Well, I mean, it's the beginning of rock and roll, but
they always called it show business, and the word business denotes a risk. So it's a risky business, and so one of the most revered people in rock and roll, who wasn't a musician but a promoter, was Alan Freed. He was revered, and he ended up getting busted for payola, but I don't think he was doing anything different than was done every day all across the coast, from coast to coast. From what I've read, and I've read a lot about different musicians because I absolutely love music and had aspirations of being a musician. The only problem was I had no talent. So you have to, well, there are some, you've heard some musicians that haven't had talent, but I wasn't one of them. Back then, yes, the musicians were getting ripped off. I remember reading some years ago someplace that Little Richard, with all the hits that he had back in the 50s, that he was making about a penny a record.
Jesus.
Right. So there's always been this rip-off for some reason, and it's in the record business and music industry, which is so sad to me because the musicians are creating something that is so absolutely beautiful and such an ingrained part of our lives, and you have these sharks around them that are
businessing the shit out of it,
businessing their lives and ripping them off and make it harder for them to produce music. Although it's weird, I read a quote this morning, I think it was by Quincy Jones, who was talking to some lady who had asked him a question about the music industry. And his quote to her was, "There is no music industry." So here it is. It's a weird place that we're in, is that we're looking back fondly at those times when the musicians were getting ripped off. But the incredible part about it, even though the musicians were getting ripped off and they were playing all kinds of games with recording the music, a shitload of beautiful music was, came through our culture. I grew up in the 60s, and I don't think there'll ever be another decade of innovation in music like there was all through the 60s. There was just every genre of music. You could turn on AM radio and hear everything from Sinatra to the Beatles to Vanilla Fudge to it was all over the place. It was all over the place. So I got to experience that too. I'm very fortunate to have experienced that.
Going back to the Quincy Jones quote, I had a discussion recently with someone on Facebook that had commented on an article about that quote, saying that he feels so sorry for music the way it is right now, and that he's concerned for the future of musicians because it's getting harder and harder for them to make money.
Right.
While I think that's true for some musicians, it seems like there's some kind of resurgence of creative talent because anyone can record anything, and there's less businessing going around the musicians. So the people that are creating now have direct distribution platforms, so there's nothing between them and their money,
the
maybe
audience.
one middleman.
Right.
Pirating is no longer necessary for people who enjoy music. For $10 a month, there are so many services that can do it for you that actually do pay out the musician. I mean, you can't expect any random person to record something and put it on Spotify and make a bunch of money on it, but it's never been that way. People have always created music and never made money on it.
Right.
And what I'm finding to be more and more fascinating is that because so many people can just create music and put it on Spotify or Amazon Music or Tidal, we're getting this enormous collection of music that's being uploaded and never listened to.
Right.
So in 20 years, people will be able to look back and do music discovery from 2017,
which
music
is
that's never
which
been
is
listened
mind
to,
blowing.
which is absolutely mind blowing.
And yeah, you bring up a great point, Jason, because maybe part of the sadness about the death of the music industry is just maybe it was because it has been our era, and it might be that we're in the middle of this huge transition in music where we're on the cusp of something. A lot of time the old saying, necessity is the mother of invention. I saw it happen in the cigar business. I've discussed with you before when the cigar boom happened in the 90s. It forced the industry to do things that they wouldn't do before because they didn't have to. So maybe now with the technology changing things, there will be things. I guess the sadness of it is what you illustrate is it's going to be 20 years before anybody gets to hear that.
Music, yeah. And I mean, the stuff that is being listened to right now is listened to largely because of promotion and or the traditional way of touring and getting your music out there. But the days of people writing some music and sending a demo and a record label going, holy shit, this is great, and plopping down a humongous check to make that person's career are done. That's not happening to but a much more select few.
Well, maybe where the rub comes in with the music industry is what we consider the music industry. And today I would consider the music industry the American Idols. The still companies that are still left, and everything is just, I mean, a lot of the stuff that I hear that's mainstream just doesn't move me. It just sounds formulaic. You can hear the musicians are great musicians, but it just doesn't move me. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, the writing isn't there for a lot of it.
And I know, like I had a guitar instructor told me 40 years ago. I asked him what was he doing teaching a schmuck like me, for $10 an hour, when the guy sounded like George Benson, Eric Clapton, and Django Reinhardt rolled into one. And he goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I have ears." I go, "You're tremendous. What are you doing here teaching me? Why aren't you making money? Why aren't you out there?" And he said, and he laughed, and he said, for every Eric Clapton that you hear, there's 1,000 Eric Claptons out there that you've never heard. And I'm sure the same thing still holds true today.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I guess, the thing is, maybe we'll never have that. We won't have the superstar things, like there used to be.
Yeah, not the way it traditionally was. I mean, I just for shits and giggles last year, I looked up Derek Trucks and how his career was going.
Right.
I've always been a fan of Derek Trucks
Right.
since
Yeah,
I
he's
first
incredible.
listened to him.
Yeah.
Derek Trucks is not someone that you would consider to be a widely famous musician.
Right.
But he is one of the wealthiest musicians in the world right now. So it seems to me like a lot of the stars are making their money in other ways instead of big checks from labels, you know?
Right.
So the products are changing, not necessarily the process.
Right. And there, talking about musicians that are unknown, I'm sure, I don't know, maybe he has more notoriety than Derek Trucks, but a musician that I love, that I've seen once, that I think is an incredible songwriter. I just love who he is. He doesn't mind exposing himself. He doesn't mind being naked in his songwriting. Is a guy named Rodney Kroll. Mm-hmm. He's in Nashville, and he's been around for a long time. He was Johnny Cash's one of Johnny Cash's ex-son-in-laws. Not a lot of people have heard of Rodney. I mean, he's well known, but he's not a superstar. Yeah. In my mind, he's a superstar. The guy's an incredible writer. He's got a great voice. And his songs are very, they're meaningful. They're very poignant and meaningful. So I guess maybe it's who you like. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
It seems like the percentage of population that's really into music enough to find people like that has been shrinking. Like the population has been growing fast enough that those people, like the total quantity of those people is growing, but the percentage of population that actually gives a shit to find new music outside of radio is kind of shrinking.
Well, and really and truly, comparing music to politics, I kind of think it's the same way because I pay attention to politics, and the things that make me want to pull my eyeballs out. There's other people that have an opinion about politicians, but they're just not going very deep into what's going on. So maybe our attention spans are. Something about our attention span. I don't know, but I know that there's nothing that as many times when we were together in the store, that I would come in and I've heard somebody new. There's nothing I like more than just having somebody new knock me out with whether it's their voice or their songwriting or their musicianship. There's nothing greater because it's to me music is a direct link to something that's greater than all of us. You've heard how many times we heard the story of musicians coming up with an idea. They woke up and they had this idea for a song. Yeah. So it comes. I think it can come. I've read a bit about this as well, that musicians don't know where their creativity, their muse comes from, but I just love being knocked out like that. Yeah. And maybe some of us have to be a little elitist. Maybe some of us have higher standards. I don't know.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah.
If the radio is just not providing the things that push your buttons for music, then why listen to it?
Right.
So going back to that was a long break there. Going back to your childhood, how old were you when you could first start choosing your music? Like how old were you when you had a record player?
11 years old.
Yeah?
Yeah, I was 11. My family, my brothers, and my mother gave me a little record player, and the first album that I was given was, because my mother knew that 11 was G.I. Blues by Elvis Presley. This is when Elvis had gone away to the Army, and most of it was, some formulaic throwaway songs, but there were a couple of tunes on that were good. And I would just collect 45s, by hook or crook. I mean, if I was driving down the street or riding down the street on my bicycle, and I saw someone had thrown something out and there were some records there, I would stop and go through the records and scavenge and buy when I had money. I would buy anything that I could get my hands on. But an Elvis record was my first. And my 45s, it was like a reflection of what AM radio was like. I had songs by, I had 45s with Johnny Mathis, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry. I mean, I was all over the place. Yeah.
So going into your teenage years, what band was most influential when you were coming of age as a man?
Well, most teenagers at that time, I was struck by the lightning bolt that happened when the Beatles came along. And when they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, I was glued to them all the way through their breakup, which took me into my early manhood. And looking back at it, as a child, there was all this hype, this cheap hype, the Beatlemania, all that stuff. It was so chintzy and just so, it was really, as a kid, you could see, it was hype. But the difference with the Beatles was the music was so goddamn good. It just, the hype, that was the music business. They were trying to suck every dime out of every teeny bopper's pocket that they could. But the music was incredible. I grew with them through all, they came out, they hit in February of 64. I was 13, and they broke up officially, I think, early in 1970. So I went through all their albums. That was my teenage years. That was my life story, everything that happened. And there were some things that I liked more than others. Like Sgt. Pepper's was a great album. That wasn't one of my favorites, although I liked the songs on it. A couple of them I love. The White Album is one of my favorites.
Yeah.
So they were geniuses. I don't know what the hell was in the water in Liverpool at the time, what they were drinking, but those guys, I think, collectively together, they were absolute geniuses. They were innovators. They were fortunate enough to get together with someone like George Martin, who could see the rawness, the energy, the creativity in their music, and helping them organize it and offer them ideas to make it greater, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was the Beatles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
After Beatlemania and your healthy obsession with the Beatles, where did music go where you feel like it went right and you feel like it went wrong?
Again, I loved all different kinds of music. I loved the Beatles. And of course, the Beatles were influenced by a lot of American music, Chuck Berry and Motown and all of that. I love soul music. I think after Dr. King was assassinated, up to that point, there was an incredible amount of music being made in Memphis. And after that point, things changed in America. Things change. There's always, everything that happens with us is always attached to politics. Those turbulent times from November of 1963, when JFK was assassinated, when Dr. King was assassinated, and shortly thereafter, Robert Kennedy. We went through some very turbulent times in the U.S., and it was things changed after that. It seemed like the world got a little harder. It got a little meaner. And there was a lot of, people, baby boomers were growing up, and we were grappling with issues that we didn't necessarily have answers to. And as part of that made it more difficult were drugs. Drugs had come into the thing, and I'm not judging drugs. I think there's a place for drugs. The experiment that was done, that was bandied about by Timothy Leary and all those guys with LSD. I'm a big proponent of using drugs in a positive way in the right environment. I don't believe in doing stupid things like making marijuana a Schedule I drug.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or mescaline, all those drugs. I think that as a society, we're hypocritical that we take those things and make them Schedule I drugs, and then have other drugs that are killing people. They're pharmaceutical drugs that the pharmaceutical companies are making billions of dollars off of. But the things that grow naturally, like mescaline, psilocybin, peyote, and marijuana, which have a true value for us, it's really hypocritical, and I hope that changes one day. But at any rate, after those assassinations, things got meaner. And it started, when you combine that confusion and hurt people being ostracized, like the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were labeled by the media as being this scary organization, but they were created as a grassroots local group to help feed school children, to give them breakfast before they went to school. And you had this confusion and mistrust of different groups. And I think that was encouraged by the government. Nixon was there. Nixon brought us the war on drugs and those types of things. So it made for a very turbulent and confusing, sometimes scary time for a young person growing up at that time. And then, of course, we had the Vietnamese War going on, which only added to that, which was another crazy thing in our history.
So it all created a very aggressive atmosphere for music, and out of that came Led Zeppelin, who is arguably, though not directly metal, the godfather of metal.
Right.
And other bands that were much more hard-hitting than rock and roll had ever seen before.
Yeah, it was the change for me when I went into the basic training in October of 1969, and up to that point, I was listening. A lot of the music I was listening was a lot of AM radio, the Beatles, the Stones, the Rascals, Motown, things like that. And in just those 2 months, when I came home for Christmas, they let us come home during basic training for Christmas for a week. Was my introduction to Led Zeppelin. And you're right, it was a completely different world. And I had some mind-altering additives when I was listening to Led Zeppelin the first time, and it enhanced the sound of the music, I must say.
I bet. Was that a terrifying experience for you? Because, I mean, in the first place, that generally breeds paranoia, but also adding an aggressive kind of rock you hadn't listened to before.
Well, it's funny. I remember riding around with this kid that I went to high school with, who introduced me to it. We were riding around earlier in the day, and he says, "I want you to listen to this." And he said, "How you like that?" And I said, "Well, it sounds, I like it, but it's kind of loud, and I can hear the blues influence. I like the blues, but yeah, I'm not that." Well, we listened to it later that night, and it was, I couldn't get those sounds out of my head they stayed there for weeks, and I was fascinated by that. That fascinated me. No, it wasn't scary. It was different. There was, it was a different experience. It could have been better because we were out in the streets.
Yeah.
You needed to experience that type of thing. It should be in a controlled environment.
Grounded.
We were young and stupid and didn't care and were invincible. But no, it wasn't paranoid at all. It was actually like science fiction. It was like being introduced to science fiction.
Yeah, like the first transition to Elvis.
Yes, that's
transition.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Was there another transition after that you found to be particularly significant in your listening?
Yeah, that time in the late '60s, there were all these new singer-songwriters, which was a kind of a new thing. At that back in the day, that you had songwriters who would write the songs, and then you had singers or bands who would perform the music, entertainers. And so you had a whole slew of singer-songwriters that came along, Carole King, James Taylor, Jackson Browne, people like that for a while that was good, but, radio beat it to death. I mean, they just beat it to frickin' death.
There's only so much pop you can handle.
Yeah, and it's, and so much introspectiveness, I mean, sometimes you just want to get up and shake your ass and dance, and that was kind of what it just got beat to death.
Yeah.
And guys were taking the Beatles would cut an album in 2 weeks. They would do an album, and these guys were taking 2, 3, 4 years to do an album.
Yeah.
I'm going, damn, is it that much better? Are you telling me it's that much better?
That much harder to make good music.
Right.
Yeah. Do you think that would have been do you think that would have been indicative to their talent comparatively?
Taking so long?
Yeah. Or just them being careful?
I think to some degree it might have been just them being a little bit too full of themselves. How much, it's like the difference between a $5 cigar and a $20 cigar. Is the $20 cigar really 4 times better than the $5 cigar?
No, the price tag is 4 times better than the $5 cigar.
So it's good music is good music. I mean, if you've got the song written, you're going to sit there and split hairs and to try to figure out how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Come on, just cut the damn record, man. Get it out there.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of that going on, and that was also at the time when the big venue tours were happening, the stadiums, which was one of the worst experiences of my life at that time. It was a little bit later on, 1974, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. When they announced that they were going to be here, I bought the tickets as soon as I could. I couldn't because I loved them. Those guys made some great music, and I especially loved Stephen Stills and Neil Young because I was into guitar, and those guys were incredible. And so I went to Tampa Stadium to see them, and it was festival seating. Mm. And never forget this. Jesse Colin Young had a couple of hits on the radio at the time, and he opened for them. It was great. He was kind of a mixture of folk and jazz, a little blues. It was, I think it might have, I can't remember if it was the 4th of July or the day before the 4th of July. It was right around the 4th of July. So Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young come on stage. I'm on the field, on a blanket with my wife, and I'm just, I'm in heaven. I'm just, so excited. And they came out and they played, I think, maybe 1 or 2 songs, and they all left the stage except for Graham Nash. He sat at a grand piano and started playing Our House. And he was about 2 bars into the song when about 5 feet from his head, a cherry bomb exploded.
Holy shit.
Somebody threw a cherry bomb up there. And I thought I was having a flashback or something. It was horrible.
Yeah.
And he played 2 or 3 more notes, and he got up and he had a harmonica around his neck. He threw the harmonica on the piano, stormed off the stage, and Stephen Stills walked out. And Stephen Stills, for those of you who don't know, did go to school here in Tampa. He went to Plant High School for a while. He moved around a lot. He walked out on stage and said, I'm paraphrasing, a few years back, I went to high school here in Tampa, Plant High School, and he goes, I know exactly the type of asshole who threw that cherry bomb. And so, from that moment on, it got crazy. They came back, they started playing songs. I saw probably people were throwing whole strings of firecrackers.
Shit.
To me, that was the day the music died. Was that day. It wasn't, when Buddy Holly died. It was that for me personally. I had seen, this was 1974. We'd gone through the Woodstock era, the singer-songwriter era. That's where we were, and that we were in the arena rock, and it was horrible.
I'd never ever heard that story.
Yeah,
That's fucking incredible.
It's out there. It's out
shit.
there. The story's out there. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Breezing by some of the 70s. A lot of people are either on the fence or firmly on either side of the 80s and what music was produced and how it affected modern music. Do you have any thoughts on the good and bad of the 80s?
Well, it's funny. Going into the 80s, I had become a parent, had two babies. Mm-hmm. I was working real hard, earning a living, just doing anything to support my family. So there were a lot of things, and I think this happens a lot of times to people when they're young and have a new family. you're so consumed with taking care of your family sometimes that you miss some things, and that can be anything from politics to film to reading to music. And so while I still listened to music at the time in the early 80s, I was still listening to radio at that time, FM radio. I would listen to whatever was on the radio. For me, nothing really was rocking my world. I heard music that I liked. It wasn't moving me as it was before. There was a lot of the it seemed like a lot of the stuff that was coming out of England at the time were new bands. Was techno stuff. Some of the stuff from the U.S. Blondie, they had more of a techno feel to it. There were guys that came along that did move me. There was something in them that was moving me with some depth. Elvis Costello, people like that. I'm sure I'm going to be missing. I'm forgetting some things, some people, but it was a little bit of a confusing time for me. I couldn't pay as much attention to music as I would like because I was busy raising my family.
Yeah.
But musically, I wasn't as focused on it as I had been before.
Right on. I'd imagine that's about how the 80s and the 90s went for you because you were raising kids through all of that.
Right.
So jumping to modern days and your recent retirement, is there any band that is younger that you have your eyes on?
Every now and then someone will come along, and I heard somebody, just by accident, I think I saw him on Live from Daryl's House a few years ago. It was a younger guy. He's originally from Chicago, and I think his father was a music critic, and he moved from Chicago. Of course, this is going back now. Again, this is going back 4, 5, 6 years, so it's not new. But he loved soul music growing up so much, listened to his father's collection. He moved to Memphis and got involved with the music scene there. And the guy was doing Memphis soul music. This white kid, moved there and I think he might even be Jewish. And it's funny that this white kid, that's the effect that music has on us. And it's what's so exciting. Eli Smith, I like. Gary Clark, Gary Clark Jr. He's someone that I like because he combines blues. You can feel a little bit of Hendrix in there.
Yeah.
So I like them. There's other people I'm not able to think of them right now. Yeah.
As a side note, Taj Mahal and Keb Mo released an album together recently.
Wow.
And it's fucking fantastic.
Right.
You should probably get on that. It's really worth it.
Well, see, that's what happened to me in the 90s was rather than so much discovering a lot of new people was rediscovering a lot of older music is what happened to me. I remember when, I've always, since the mid-'60s, had a strong taste for blues music. But Eric Clapton did this homage album to his heroes from the Cradle, and that blew me away. And listening to that was an urging for me to go back and listen to the original music. And that's a beautiful thing. And a friend of mine he knew I liked blues music, and he gave me a Howlin' Wolf compilation. And I didn't take it out of the CD out of my car player for probably 3 months. I think probably of all the musicians, I have probably a higher regard for Howlin' Wolf than anyone because his music was innovative. There were different eras that he went through with different lead guitarists. What he was doing, he did it pretty quickly. He wasn't taking the 4 to 5 years to do an album. He would do an album in a week.
Yeah.
And Buddy Guy was, I think, one of the musicians that would sometimes sit in that whole Chicago Chess Records thing. So that urged me to egg me on to read his biography. And my admiration grew for him, not only as a musician, but as a human being. The guy overcame so much, and did so much with his life, while earning great respect from people around him. And I just so that was one thing that for me in the 90s was a rediscovery of some of the older music. I kind of went back to my roots and started just looking back and sometimes would be surprised and go, oh, wow, he did that, or musicians, guys that were side musicians with a bigger star that later on came into to their own, and I didn't realize that they had, like Lou Rawls was one of Sam Cooke's singers. And Lou Rawls, when I was a young man in the late 60s, early 70s, he was a giant, right on through to the early 80s. Guy had an incredible voice, and he was one of Sam Cooke's singers, So that's what I love about music, is the connections, the 6 degrees of separation.
The ebb and flow of it is very interesting all the time. So going forward in music, is there a certain genre you want to focus on? I know that you listen to a lot of different stuff, but with hopefully a little more free time for you, is there a certain thing that you want to dig into?
What's really weird about me is I'll be stuck in a genre or a band. Say, like, one of my favorite bands are the Mavericks, who were real big in the 90s. They were winning Grammys. I wasn't into them. I discovered them in the late 90s. And so I just went back, like, as I will do, I'll go back and gobble up everything that they've done and became huge fans. They're a great performance band. They'll do 3-hour shows. Raul Malo, I think, has one of the best voices ever in pop and rock music. He's has an incredible talent. He's a Cuban boy from Miami.
And he sings in English and Spanish, which is really awesome.
And started out doing Led Zeppelin covers in Miami. And so I'll be going along, stuck in listening to this band, and then one day I'll hear something different that will distract me, and I'll go, like the way I discovered the Gorillaz. I was just stunned by their creativity, that they could do this melange of music and creating this whole. It was almost like reading a book, their music, and they have, they had different styles that they've done. So I don't have anything in particular. It might be something very old. It might be something very new. If something strikes a chord within me,
Cool. So, any final thoughts for the listeners?
Sometimes, music critics, they have a job they're fulfilling, but I've been disappointed more by music critics than they've pleased me. One of the worst albums I ever bought in my life was based on a recommendation from a music critic, and it was a horrible album. What I would suggest to listeners is just like what you like. Don't let anybody influence you one way or the other. And if there's something that you really love, delve into what influenced that type of music. It might help you discover other types of great music or where that music came from. How do people, and I just, one thing, everybody has to work.